Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Craig Floyd, and I'm the chairman and CEO of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. And I want to welcome all of you here today to the museum's Witness to History, investigating the Unabomber, the 10th in our series of Witness to History events, generously sponsored by our friends from Target who join us here in the front row, as well as in partnership today with the Newseum, our hosts. And I'll turn things over to John Maynard in just a moment from the Newseum for the moderation of today's event. But I want to thank all of you for coming. Today's just a glorious day outside, and the fact that you would want to spend an hour or two here with us, that's extra special. And I thank you for taking the time to join us. I think you're in for just a fascinating discussion here in just a moment. I also want to thank our friends from C-SPAN who tend to cover many of these Witness to History events. They're with us once again today, and they'll be sharing this on air over the coming weeks. For those of you who may not be familiar with the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, our organization, a little background: we were formed in 1984 by Congressman Mario Biaggi, a former New York City police officer and police legend. He actually is the author of the legislation to establish the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, which was our first major initiative. We dedicated that memorial in 1991. It sits just a couple of blocks from here in Judiciary Square, the 400 block of E Street, Northwest Washington. And on the walls of that memorial are the names of 20,267 federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement professionals who have given their lives in the line of duty. Our latest initiative is to establish a National Law Enforcement Museum. And we've been working on this now since 2000, when Congress authorized our organization to build the first ever National Law Enforcement Museum. We've been working on it ever since, and that museum will open in just a few years from now in a place, again, called Judiciary Square, right across the street from the National Memorial. But in many ways, our museum already exists. We've collected more than 17,000 artifacts, fascinating artifacts of American law enforcement history that will help us tell that story. And we've also produced a number of educational and public programming events, of which Witness to History is part of that. This afternoon is certainly a good example. We bring together law enforcement professionals, experts who were involved in some of the most famous criminal cases in American history. And today we bring together a group of experts who worked so diligently and for so long on the Unabomber investigation, one of the longest manhunts in American law enforcement history. And I want to just thank once again our friends from Target for sponsoring today's event and all of our Witness to History events. And I now would like to turn our program over to John Maynard, who will moderate today's program. John, please join us here.
Well, thank you, Craig. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you watching on C-SPAN. Welcome to the Newseum's Night TV studio, and welcome to the Newseum, home of the Unabomber's cabin. Hope you've all had a chance to see that down on our concourse level. And again, we are so pleased to be partnering with the National Law Enforcement Museum for today's program. Well, for nearly 2 decades, beginning in 1978, an elusive criminal sent homemade bombs that targeted universities, airlines, and computer stores, killing 3 people and injuring 23 others. The FBI branded him the Unabomber, and despite an investigation that spanned 8 states and involved about 500 agents, the FBI was flummoxed. But a 35,000-word manifesto written by the Unabomber, whose real name was Ted Kaczynski, and sent to various publications, proved a turning point and brought an end to the Unabomber's reign of terror. But even before the manifesto, the investigation was hampered by complex layers of bureaucracy and institutional pride, some professional jealousies, and some individual egos. But today, we talk to 3 FBI agents who were charged by then FBI Director Louis Freeh to bring finality to the case by cutting through the cumbersome procedures of the investigation and breaking free of bureaucratic restraint. Their new book, Unabomber: How the FBI Broke Its Own Rules to Capture the Terrorist Ted Kaczynski, details the FBI's investigation into the Unabomber and how these 3 men worked together and within the agency to bring him down. Jim Freeman, to my left, was the special agent in charge of the multi-agency Unabomber investigation and oversaw strategic management at the executive level. He began his career as a special agent with the FBI in 1964 with assignments in Oklahoma City, Los Angeles, and Miami. And in 1993, he was assigned as special agent in charge of the San Francisco division. Following the Unabomber investigation, he returned from the FBI in 1996, retired from the FBI in 1996, and he joined Charles Schwab, and just recently retired as Senior VP of Global Security. Max Noel, sitting to Jim's left, served as investigator on the Unabomber task force before ultimately becoming special agent supervisor of an expanded task force and ultimately concentrating on Montana. He served as an FBI agent for 30 years and worked on numerous high-profile investigations, including the Weather Underground, the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. He retired from the FBI in 1999. Terry Turchie directed the Unabomber Federal Task Force between 1994 and 1998 on an operational level. Following the Unabomber case, he became inspector and led the task force in the hunt for Olympic bomber Eric Rudolph. In 1999, he was named deputy assistant in the new counterterrorism division of the FBI and traveled extensively overseas to investigate international terrorism in the Middle East and in the former Soviet Union. I should also note in the book, Jim writes that Terry is the only FBI agent that he knows who got into a fight with a Russian spy when he wrestled a KGB agent to the ground on a Brooklyn subway platform in 1986. So please welcome our panel. If you're tweeting today's conversation, please use the Newseum's handle, which is @Newseum, and the National Law Enforcement handle, which is @NLEOMF. Okay, Jim, let's start with you. All three of you are listed as co-authors, but the book is told from your perspective. Tell us how the book came together and what was your main objective for the book.
Well, thank you for your kind comments for introducing the three of us. Yeah. And I want to point out that we represent dozens of FBI agents and ATF agents and officers of the U.S. Postal Inspection Service who all made work together for that task force those last 3 years. You might imagine how many individuals and how much work went into such a project. And the book came about in a very similar way to how the investigation came about those last 2 years when I had volunteered to Louis Freeh. I would think I was the only volunteer ever for the Unabomber task force after 16 years of inability to find him. But I volunteered because I was already in San Francisco, and that's where the task force had been set up. And so I wanted to take a shot at catching Ted Kaczynski. The investigation required that I look for a team that would bring together a strategic plan. And Terry Turchie was where I went. He was already in the San Francisco office. He was a supervisor of national intelligence matters in the Palo Alto resident agency. And I decided I wanted a different perspective. I wanted to shake it up. I mean, after 16 years, what could I do but shake it up to try to do something different? And in the FBI, there's definitely, at that time, a wall between the National Intelligence Service and the Criminal Investigative Division for various reasons. But I wanted to take advantage of the synergy of that in preparing a strategic plan and executing it. And the book came together kind of the same way. It was a matter of the three of us represent a unique perspective in the way the case was managed, and so we wrote it in that manner. We didn't want to write a book that stood on its own as our own creation. We wanted to just do a definitive description of the investigation, which was very complex and had, over the years, had not been appropriately described in any of the many books that have been written about the Unabomber case, or about mostly that centered on Ted Kaczynski. Right. We wrote the book to center on the investigation.
Mm-hmm. Terry and Max, I'll ask you both. Tell us about your reaction when you were asked to join this kind of newly formed task force.
Go ahead.
Well, I was a bit stunned. I was very happy in Palo Alto, and any of you familiar with California know that's a pretty nice place to be. We had an office across the street from Stanford, and I was pretty settled for the rest of my career, at least I thought, until Jim had this bizarre idea that he was going to solve Unabomber. And so I got a call one day, and it was